Our scripture reading this morning comes from Luke, chapter 9, verses 28 through 36. Listen to these words of scripture, and in them the Spirit's word to you. Now, about 8 days after these sayings, Jesus took with him Peter and John and James, and went up on the mountain to pray. And while he was praying, the appearance of his face changed. His clothes became dazzling white. Suddenly, they saw with them two men, Moses and Elijah, talking to him. They appeared in glory and were speaking of his departure, which he was about to accomplish at Jerusalem. Now Peter and his companions were weighed down with sleep, but since they had stayed awake, they saw his glory and the two men who stood with him. Just as they were leaving him, Peter said to Jesus, "Master, it is good for us to be here. Let us make 3 dwellings, one for you, one for Moses, and one for Elijah," not knowing what he said. While he was saying this, a cloud came and overshadowed them, and they were terrified as they entered the cloud. Then from the cloud came a voice that said, "This is my son, my chosen. Listen to him." And when the voice had spoken, Jesus was found alone. And they kept silent and in those days told no one any of the things they had seen. Holy wisdom, holy word. Thanks be to God.
Good morning. This morning we have reached the final story in our Epiphany journey. Throughout the season, we have caught glimpses of the sacred shining through in unexpected places. We wondered at wise ones who were awake to moral good and followed it. We marveled how the thresholds of water and wine remind us of our interconnectedness. We heard the call and challenge of discipleship proclaiming the sanctity of all life. And today we look at the Transfiguration, which is the exclamation point at the end of the Epiphany season. In the days preceding the Transfiguration, Jesus empowers the disciples to go out and begin their own ministries among the people. So they go off throughout the region, bringing good news and healing. And after a time, Jesus and the disciples meet together again. A large crowd gathers to see them and to hear Jesus speak. They share a meal of fish and bread with baskets and baskets left over. The crowd dwindles. People return to their homes, baskets of leftovers in hand. The disciples and Jesus are left together by the fire. Some of the disciples are remarking on the day's events. Some are sharing how their ministries are going. We've met so many people who want to get involved, who are excited about what we were doing. We've helped so many. And it's all because of you, Jesus. You started this. You made this possible. Surely the best is yet to come. Jesus listens, saying nothing. The chatter continues, and Peter leans over and says, "You must be the Messiah. You must be the one who is going to overthrow Rome and right all the wrongs that we have been suffering. How could you not be the one?" At this, Jesus breaks his silence and says, "Don't spread this news around of me being the Messiah. People have lots of different ideas about what Messiah means. I will tell you what it means. It means suffering and death. But death will not be the end." At the sound of Jesus' voice, the others have looked over from their separate conversations, staring quietly at Peter and Jesus. apart from completely ruining the mood, I imagine Jesus' words did not compute. Jesus predicts his death 3 times in Luke. In the other 2 instances, Luke says that the disciples do not understand, or they are afraid to ask Jesus about it. I imagine the first time hearing these words, it might be easy to be in denial. Well, that doesn't make sense. I'm just going to pretend that he didn't mean that. There's no way that is the plan. About a week later, Jesus, Peter, James, and John make their way up to the mountaintop for prayer. Peter, James, and John are very tired. It has been a long week. They have been reunited with their companions. They have eaten their fill of fish and bread and wine. Their bellies are full. Their hearts are full. And they have tried to put Jesus' words about his death out of their minds. Peter, James, and John begin to nod off. As they drift in and out of sleep, Jesus' physical appearance seems to change. He looks brighter somehow. He is the same, and yet he is completely different. And Jesus is not alone. Moses and Elijah are there, and they are talking about the time when Jesus will depart, when he might die. Something about this dream does not feel entirely like a dream. Peter shakes himself awake and alerts the other 2. Hardly able to believe his eyes, Peter immediately says, "We must put up dwellings. Let's prolong this amazing thing for as long as possible." But just at this moment, a cloud descends, and a voice proclaims again, as it did at Jesus' baptism, "This is my son. Listen to him." The clouds disperse. Jesus, Peter, James, and John are alone again on the top of the mountain, surrounded by darkness, the sound of a soft breeze blowing through the grasses. The disciples share sideways glances with one another, each baffled by what they think they have seen and heard. Each of them kind of squinting at Jesus in the moonlight. Something is different, but they are unable to name it. Uncertain of what they have witnessed, the disciples agree to keep quiet about their vision on the mountain. Some have decided this passage is evidence of Jesus' divinity. Others have decided that it is a shared lucid dream. Wherever you fall on the spectrum of interpretation, what is apparent is that a change has occurred. As it may have been at Jesus' baptism, perhaps Jesus' vision becomes a little clearer about what is to come. Perhaps he gains resolve for the work that is ahead. Perhaps he recognizes that change is necessary to meet the moment. Whatever the case, what was set in motion at Jesus' baptism is now hastening toward a series of escalating events that Jesus' followers do not expect. Jesus and the disciples will leave the mountaintop to go out among the people, where Jesus will attract more attention. Jesus will be even bolder and more brazen than he had previously been. Jesus will publicly denounce the scribes, the Pharisees, the lawyers, the rich, and the powerful. Jesus will assert the unthinkable. The destruction of the temple and the holy city will happen, and happen soon. The individuals who believe they are untouchable, to the individuals who profess exceptionalism and superiority. Jesus is effectively saying that the proverbial mountaintop of the rich and powerful will and must crumble. A mountaintop can be many things. It can be a place for centering, for respite, to lick wounds and seek solace. A place where epiphany finds its way in and nestles itself into our cellular makeup, altering us forever. But a mountaintop can also be a place where we lose focus of the valley. A place where it is easy to set up a dwelling and exist in a bubble of our own making. Meanwhile, real life happens in the valley. People live in the war and poverty-stricken valley. The rich continue to squeeze as much as they can from the poor. Landlords who received COVID relief are still evicting struggling tenants. Russia invades Ukraine. That's what's going on in the valley. In his book, Reality, Grief, Hope, Walter Brueggemann writes that there are 3 urgent tasks facing the church today. The first is to articulate reality in the midst of ideology, meaning the church must not perpetuate mindless rhetoric or dogma, but actively name reality. The second is to grieve, meaning when something has changed, when something has been lost, the appropriate response is grief. The pervading response is denial, a pushing forward as if everything is the same, and that helps no one. The third task is to proclaim hope instead of despair, meaning that when reality is acknowledged and appropriately grieved, there is eventually room to begin again. Brueggemann is suggesting this is the role of the church against the ideology of American exceptionalism and all that comes with it. However, I think this is a step ahead of where we actually might be as the church at large. I do not think the church at large is adequately prepared to counter American exceptionalism because the church has spent too little time on its own transfiguration. The church has spent too little time on its own transfiguration. While the church has done good things, in many ways the church has also set up a dwelling on the mountaintop, a bubble of its own making. The church got to the mountaintop, experienced some transformation, and like Peter exclaimed, "This is great! Let's stay here." And it did. Not understanding that the process is continual, forgetting that the call requires going up and down the mountain, in and out of the valley again and again. The world outside of the church's bubble began to change. And then the church began to feel the impact of that change, and panic set in. First, people stopped coming to church. Then younger generations left in droves. In the last few years, the resignation of ministers has been at an all-time high. The pervading ideology is that the church should be in a physical building, filled with people singing hymns, hearing a sermon, giving their money, having all the right programs, and anything else is failure. Anything else is not church. But the reality is that the world and the people in it have changed. Things have changed, and the church has forgotten how to grieve. Instead, the church remains in denial. Instead of grieving, the church spends an awful lot of time and energy and resources trying to stay comfortable, trying to protect its identity, trying to get back to a time when pews were full and resources were plenty, trying to contort itself in all kinds of shapes in order to appeal to folks who don't want to be at church the way that church does church. Instead of grief, the church tries desperately to parade around a dead ideology. And in that place, the church wrings its hands and despairs. The Transfiguration is a reminder that change is not only constant, change is a requirement. It is a reminder that making our way down the mountain is just as important as making our way up. It is a reminder that neither mountain nor valley is a place for settling in and staying the same. The Transfiguration is a call to change, and then bringing change and being change where change is needed most. My hope has long been that the church at large will seriously invest in the much-needed work of transfiguration. It begins with us, I think. As we enter into our Lenten season, there will be regular opportunities to collectively name realities in our society and in our faith community, to grieve those realities, and to hope for the future. Next Sunday will be the first Sunday of Lent and our first opportunity. After the service, I invite you to join me for a picnic lunch and conversations specifically around our collective grief. Between the realities of a pandemic, the death of several of our loved ones, Pastor Liz's departure, there is much to name and to process. What do we grieve? Who are we now? What does it look like to move forward? These are some of the important questions that we will have the opportunity to discuss. And I hope you will join me in this important work.